Yeah, welcome back to the channel, and today we continue with endocrine systems and homeostasis, right? And our first focus is on how the body is able to regulate the carbon dioxide concentration within the body, right? Now, it is worth noting carbon dioxide is a waste product that is produced during cellular respiration, and since it is a waste product, the body must be able to get rid of carbon dioxide within the human body. Now, carbon dioxide is a problem when it is in very high concentration, and we're going to see a spike in the carbon dioxide concentration under intense physical activities. When you're undergoing intense physical activities, then the concentration of carbon dioxide is going to increase. This is due to an increase in the rate of cellular respiration to provide a sufficient energy for the activity that you'll be performing, right? Now, let's talk about when you're doing an intense physical activity. The concentration of carbon dioxide is going to increase, right? So we're going to have a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, right? But when we have a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, this is a problem. Why is it a problem? This is simply because the high carbon dioxide concentration is going to combine with water. Now, the combination of carbon dioxide and water is a problem. Why is it a problem? This is simply because when we combine carbon dioxide and water, it is going to form an acid, and this acid we call it carbonic acid, right? So a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood will simply combine with water. Now, when it combines with water, it is going to form an acid that is called carbonic acid, right? So in the blood, there's going to be acid now, so to speak, right? Now, we know that the pH of an acid is less than 7, right? And we know that for a pH to be normal, right, it needs to be 7. This is neutral. So when we say the blood becomes acidic, we are going to drop the pH towards 1, right? So because carbonic acid has been produced, then the blood pH is going to be lowered. This simply tells us that the blood now has got more acid. It is becoming acidic due to the addition of this carbonic acid, right? Now, because the pH of the blood has been lowered, then there are receptors within the body. We call these receptors chemoreceptors. And where do we find these chemoreceptors? We find them in the carotid artery. It is found somewhere around the neck, right? These chemoreceptors, they are going to be stimulated by the drop in the pH. So they are going to detect that the pH has dropped due to the addition of this carbonic acid. So these chemoreceptors, they are going to be stimulated by the drop in the pH, right? Now we know that the function of any receptor is simply to convert a stimulus into nerve impulse. So because these chemoreceptors that are found in the carotid artery have been stimulated by this drop in pH, they are going to convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse. This is our message, right? Now, the nerve impulse that has been produced is going to be sent to the medulla oblongata in the brain. Now, why are the nerve impulses going to be sent to the medulla oblongata in the brain? This is simply because the medulla oblongata is the control center for breathing, right? We know that in order to get rid of carbon dioxide within the human body, we need to exhale. So when this carbon dioxide concentration is high, it will combine with water. When carbon dioxide combines with water, it will form carbonic acid. The consequence of carbon dioxide combining with water to form carbonic acid is that it is going to lower the blood pH. Now, as a consequence of the blood pH being low, chemoreceptors, these are found in the carotid artery, which is found in the neck, are going to be stimulated. What is going to stimulate these chemoreceptors? It is the drop in the pH. Now, because these chemoreceptors are receptors, they are going to convert the stimulus into nerve impulse. A nerve impulse is our message. Now, this nerve impulse is going to be sent to the medulla oblongata in the brain. Why to the medulla oblongata? Because the medulla oblongata is the control center for breathing, right? So when these nerve impulses are sent to the medulla oblongata, the medulla oblongata is going to interpret these nerve impulses. It is going to try to understand what these nerve impulses are saying. Now it is going to respond. How does the medulla oblongata respond to the nerve impulses coming from the chemoreceptors? Well, it is going to respond by sending impulses of its own to two paths. It is going to send impulses to the heart and also to the breathing muscles, right? Now, if you don't want to say to the breathing muscles, you can explicitly state the breathing muscles, that is the diaphragm as well as the intercostal muscles. We actually learned this in grade 11, right? Now, when the medulla oblongata has sent impulses to the heart as well as the breathing muscles, what is going to happen at the heart and at the breathing muscles? Well, the heart is going to beat faster. Why is it beating faster? So that blood is pumped faster, right? Faster from where? Faster from the tissues to the lungs. That is what must happen, right? Next point. It says that the breathing muscles, this is the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, they are going to cause the breathing movement to speed up. You are going to be breathing very fast. If this is a consequence of nerve impulses being sent by the medulla oblongata to these breathing muscles. So they are going to contract and relax very fast. And this is going to cause you to breathe very fast. Now, as a consequence of breathing very fast, you are going to remove carbon dioxide very quickly. This is because you are breathing very fast, right? The breathing rate has increased. So carbon dioxide is going to be removed very quickly from the body. Through which process? Exhalation. We know that in order for exhalation to occur, blood that is carrying carbon dioxide, we actually refer to this blood as being deoxygenated blood, flows into the lungs, specifically to the alveolus, through the pulmonary artery, and that is where gaseous exchange is going to take place. Carbon dioxide will move into the alveolus through diffusion, and then you are going to be able to exhale that carbon dioxide. Hence, the heart must beat faster so that this blood that is carrying carbon dioxide can flow faster to the alveolus in the lungs so that you may exhale this carbon dioxide, right? Now, as a process of removing this carbon dioxide quickly from the body, the same also apply for oxygen. You are going to inhale to take in more oxygen because you are breathing faster. So you take in more oxygen and remove more carbon dioxide at the same time. Now, as a consequence, the concentration of carbon dioxide within the blood is going to drop back to normal, right? So this is how the human body is able to regulate the concentration of carbon dioxide within the human body. It is this simple, right? Now, let's look at some revision. This is grade 11 stuff. Now, let's start here. This is showing gaseous exchange at the tissues, right? This is gaseous exchange at the tissues. Now, we know that tissues are made of cells. And within these cells, there's a process that occurs. We call it cellular respiration, right? During cellular respiration, glucose is going to be broken down in order to release energy. But in the process of breaking down glucose in order to release energy, carbon dioxide is going to be produced as a byproduct. So in these tissues, there's going to be a high concentration of carbon dioxide. But we are going to look at this blood coming in these blood capillaries. This is blood coming from the lungs. And since this is blood coming from the lungs, it is richly supplied with oxygen. This is oxygenated blood. So what we have here is that in the blood capillaries at these tissues, there's going to be a high concentration of oxygen. But in the tissues, there's going to be a high concentration of carbon dioxide. Now we're going to have gaseous exchange. We're going to have diffusion. So oxygen will move from these blood capillaries that has got a high concentration of oxygen and into the tissues, right? And then carbon dioxide will also move from the tissues into the blood capillaries where there's a lower concentration of carbon dioxide. From there, this blood now that has got a higher concentration of carbon dioxide is going to be taken into the lungs, and it will arrive to the lungs via the pulmonary artery, from where carbon dioxide will be in higher concentration in the pulmonary artery, and it is going to be diffused into the alveolus, and then we are going to breathe it out through exhalation, right? Now, that is it for gaseous exchange. Now, let's look at thermoregulation. Now, thermoregulation simply refers to the ability of the body to regulate body temperature, right? To keep it in a small temperature range. Now, the normal human body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, right? So, when we talk about thermoregulation, we're trying to keep the body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius, not lower, not higher, 37 degrees Celsius, right? Now, before we can explain the processes, let's look at the provided diagrams here. Now, these diagrams are going to represent the skin of a person during a cold day and also the skin of a person during a hot day. We need to be able to differentiate between the two and tell which one represents a person in a hot or a cold day, right? Now, let's try to label the parts that we have here. So we're going to have this part, and this part is just blood vessels, right? These are blood capillaries. These are blood vessels. And then from there, we've got this part here. This is simply a sweat gland. A sweat gland. This is where a sweat is produced. And then sweat gland, we're going to also have a sweat duct. Now, this is a U. Now, in the sweat gland, this is where sweat is going to be produced. But when sweat is produced, it must be transported by means of a duct to the surface of the skin, right? Now, a sweat gland therefore has to be a type of an exocrine gland. Now, what differentiates an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland? Well, point number one is that endocrine glands secrete what we call hormones, but an exocrine gland does not secrete a hormone. And in this case, we've got a gland here that is called a sweat gland. It does not secrete a hormone, it secretes sweat. So it is exocrine in that sense. Point number two, endocrine glands, they pour their secretions directly into the bloodstream. So when hormones have been produced, they are secreted or they are released into the blood. That is how they are going to be transported throughout the body. But when we talk about exocrine glands, their secretions, they are carried by means of ducts, not in the blood. So hence we have got a sweat duct here. So this further makes the point that the sweat gland is an exocrine gland, right? Now, what we have here, if we look at the sweat gland, this one in person B, it has produced sweat. But when we look at person A here, there is no sweat here. Now, it tells me that this sweat gland is more active. It is more active because sweat has been produced. But this one of person A is less active because there is no sweat that has been produced. So if we try to reason which one is experiencing heat and which one is experiencing cold, then person B is in a hot day, but person A is in a cold day. That is what we can come up with when we're simply looking at the sweat. But we can also be able to differentiate between the two by looking at the blood vessels. Now, the blood vessels of a person that is experiencing high temperatures in a hot day, the blood vessels become dilated. They become very big. But the blood vessels of a person that is experiencing cold temperatures, they become constricted. That is to say, they become very small. Now, if we compare the size of the blood vessels in person B and also the blood vessels of person A here, we can tell that in terms of thickness, they are different. Person A has got a thicker blood vessel. We say this blood vessel has been dilated. And the process through which this blood vessel become dilated, we call it vasodilation. But if we look at person A here, the blood vessels are very thin. Then the process that results in these vessels becoming very thin, we call it vasoconstriction. So there are two ways in which we can differentiate between the two diagrams in order to tell if a person is experiencing heat or if the person is experiencing coldness. We're going to look at the sweat that is produced, and if sweat is produced, it tells us that the sweat gland is active and therefore it produces sweat. We also look at the blood vessels. If they are thick, we say they are dilated. And the process through which these blood vessels become dilated, we call it vasodilation. Now, as a consequence of vasodilation, more blood is going to flow to the surface of the skin. This is because the blood vessels are wider and therefore they can accommodate more blood. So as a consequence, more blood is going to flow to the surface of the skin. But when we look at vasoconstriction on a cold day, the blood vessels are very small. Therefore, less blood. There is less blood flowing to the surface of the skin. Right? Now, why is it important for more blood to flow to the surface of the skin? This is so that more heat can be lost. So this is blood that is hot, that is carrying heat. So when it flows to the surface of the skin, more heat is lost. What about sweat? What is the significance of producing sweat? Also, so that more heat is lost through the production of sweat, right? But when we look at person A, the blood vessels are very thin. As we've already said, it means that less blood flows to the surface of the skin. And as a consequence of less blood flowing to the surface of the skin, then less heat is going to be lost in this person. Also, there is no sweat production here, and therefore there is no loss of heat through the secretion of sweat. Now, let's look at the processes themselves, right? So we're going to look at vasodilation, in a thermoregulation in a hot day, and also thermoregulation on a cold day. We're going to differentiate between the two processes. Now let's try to look at thermoregulation on a hot day. We're trying to tell how does the body control body temperature when it is very hot. All right. Now the receptors in the skin that are going to detect heat, they are called heat receptors. These heat receptors, we find them in the skin, and they're going to be stimulated by this heat. Now we know that the function of any receptor is simply to convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse, and hence we're going to say that the heat receptors are stimulated. Once they're stimulated, they're going to convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse. This nerve impulse now is our message. Now once we have this nerve impulse, the nerve impulse is going to be transmitted or sent to the hypothalamus. Now, why are the nerve impulses going to be sent to the hypothalamus? This is simply because the hypothalamus is the control center for temperature, right? So the nerve impulses are going to be sent to the hypothalamus. Now, once these nerve impulses are sent to the hypothalamus is going to transmit impulses of its own, and these impulses are going to be sent to the blood vessels of the skin. Why are the nerve impulses from the hypothalamus going to be sent to the blood vessels of the skin? Well, because it is hot, the blood vessels of the skin are going to become dilated. That is why the hypothalamus sends impulses to the blood vessels of the skin, so that the blood vessels of the skin become dilated. Now remember, we said that dilated simply means these blood vessels become wider. And the process of these blood vessels becoming wider, we simply call it vasodilation. Right? Now, because the blood vessels now have become wider, then more blood is able to flow to the surface of the skin. Now, why is more blood able to flow to the surface of the skin now? This is simply because the blood vessels have become wider, and as a consequence, they are able to accommodate more blood flowing through them. Right? Now, when more blood flows to the surface of the skin, more heat is going to be lost as a process, as a product. Right? Now, after more heat is lost, through more blood flowing to the surface of the skin, we also know that in a hot day, the sweat gland is going to become active. And when it is active, it is going to secrete more sweat. It is going to produce more sweat. Now, when this sweat is produced, it is going to be carried by the sweat duct to the surface of the skin, where it is going to become evaporated. Right? Now, when sweat becomes evaporated, as a consequence, it is lost. Right? So when sweat is produced, it flows via the sweat duct to the surface of the skin, where it is going to evaporate. And when sweat evaporates, heat is lost. Right? Then, as a consequence of these two processes, which is more blood flowing to the surface of the skin and the production of sweat, which is then going to evaporate once it reaches the surface of the skin, the temperature of the body now is going to drop back to normal. Now, let's look at thermoregulation on a cold day. Now, the receptors that detect coldness, we call them the cold receptors. And again, they are found in the skin, right? So these cold receptors, they are going to be stimulated. They are going to detect the drop in temperature. And as such, because they've been stimulated by this coldness, they are going to simply convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse. Once this nerve impulse has been produced, it is going to be sent to the hypothalamus of the brain. Again, why the hypothalamus? Simply because the hypothalamus is the control center for temperature. Right? Now, once this nerve impulses reach the hypothalamus is going to send impulses of its own to the blood vessels of the skin. Now, why a nerve impulse is going to be sent to the blood vessels of the skin? Because it is cold, the blood vessels of the skin are going to become constricted. Now, to become constricted, we already said that the blood vessels simply become thinner. And the process of these blood vessels becoming thinner, we simply refer to it as vasoconstriction, right? Now, because of vasoconstriction, because of the blood vessels becoming very narrow, then less blood is going to flow to the surface of the skin. When less blood flows to the surface of the skin, as a consequence, less heat is going to be lost. So more heat is maintained here. Because less heat is lost, because less blood flows to the surface of the skin. Therefore, more heat is reserved and less heat is lost. Right? Now, there's also going to be less production of sweat. Because it is cold, there's no need to produce sweat, right? And because less sweat has been produced, then less heat is also going to be lost through the evaporation of sweat. There's going to be very little heat that is lost through sweat evaporation. This is simply because less sweat has been formed in the first place, right? Now, through less blood flowing to the surface of the skin and less sweat being produced, and consequently less heat being lost through the evaporation of sweat, simply because less sweat has been formed, then the temperature of the body is going to rise back to normal, simply because we are losing less heat, right? Yeah, so this is it for today. If you liked what we were to say, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.